Voilà, mesdames et messieurs, je suis très très heureux de vous voir aujourd'hui, ce soir, et pour la deuxième fois durant la même semaine, parce que nous avons lancé ces rencontres internationales de l'Académie royale de Belgique, effectivement, lundi, en accueillant le professeur Chin, qui est le président de la China Foreign Affairs University, qui forme les diplomates, je dirais, de Chine, et qui nous a expliqué sa vision personnelle, comme il aimait à le dire, sa vision personnelle de la global governance. Et 2 jours plus tard, nous voici with Professor Ikenberry about the global governance as well, but from an American point of view, and I am very happy to welcome him in this Royal Academy of Belgium. It's very important for us to open the doors to another public, multilinguistic, but also English speaking, because the Royal Academy of Belgium is of course a French-speaking institution, but if we want to speak about global governance and international relations, of course, we will do it also in English. But for the next session in October, the 3rd of October, we will have a very interesting debate on Brexit, but between 2 professors of Cambridge, probably the only one who is pro-Brexit, Professor Toms, and another professor, Professor Gamble, from the Police Center in Cambridge University, and they will debate about Brexit some month before the date of this very important event for Europe and also, of course, for UK. So, but today I'm very, very happy to welcome Professor Ikenberry, and before I will give the floor to Professor Mario Telò, who is the scientific advisor for this series, and I would like to thank him again very warmly for his participation to this opening of the Royal Academy of Belgium. And so I give the floor to Mario Telò. Thank you very much.
I'm very happy to be here and very happy to have Professor John Ikenberry here with us today, speaking about the United States and the global governance in his particular vision. Don't wait for an official presentation. We don't like the official presentation. It's a distinctive intellectual position by Professor Ikenberry. We welcome Professor Ikenberry on behalf of the Academy, as Didier Viviers said, which is opening a new program by this series, and also on behalf of the Institut d'études européennes of the ULB, represented by the President Anne Weyenberg, and the Gemstone Network, represented by the professor leading our unit in the various universities, by the PhD students. Thank you for being here. It's very important, can be very important for you to interplay with Professor Ikenberry for several reasons. The first one is the outstanding academic quality of the speaker tonight. Is a leading international scholar, author of many reference books, and strongly committed in foreign policy debate in the United States and abroad, particularly through as an editorialist of the journal Foreign Affairs that everybody knows. John Ikenberry is Albert Milbourne Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University in the Department of Politics and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He is also co-director of Princeton Center for International Security Studies, and he provides a report on national security with, if I'm not wrong, with Anne-Marie Slaughter, jointly published with Anne-Marie Slaughter, which is Belgian as origin. And so, let me underline, first of all, the depth of gratitude we have toward this school of thought. This school of thought was extraordinarily relevant in opening the United States academia to a pluralist debate in international relations theory beyond the mainstream theoretical approach, which is the neorealist approach defended by Kenneth Waltz in the best way. But starting in 85, 84, with the famous book of Bob Keohane, After Hegemony and Neorealism and its Critics, it was opened the way, an avenue to a new research, focusing on complex interdependence, transnationalism, on regime theory, and also particular neo-institutionalism. And this school has Professor Keohane and Professor Ikenberry as outstanding representative, and you know many of the members, Andrew Moravsik, Sophie Meunier, and others, which have contributed to our research, our PhD school in the previous years on a regular basis. Bob Keohane contributed to the foundation of our PhD school, Gemstone. So I would like to remember that Professor Ikenberry will speak about United States and global order. He will use, as is done in international literature, particularly by United States scholars, the word liberalism. The word liberalism provokes sometimes transatlantic misunderstandings. And I think I would like to pay a very modest contribution to avoid this misunderstanding, in particular in a French-speaking city like Brussels, very influenced by the French debate. Bob Keohane said that in order to avoid such misunderstanding, he told me when he was kind enough to send the introduction to my book on international relations theory to say, I prefer in Europe to be called a progressive institutionalist, because this avoids the misunderstanding, the confusion between liberalism and neoliberalism. My reference is Kant, is not the Chicago School of Milton Friedman. My reference is the institutional framework, evolving institutional framework, is not the Washington Consensus. So to avoid misunderstanding, I prefer to be called progressive institutional. And this is the translation I propose in French, institutionnalisme progressif. And I am very curious to understand what John thinks about this translation. Bertolt Brecht said that translation is very important as an intellectual work, but also we said in French that traduire, c'est trahir. So it's not so easy to have this transatlantic debate about liberalism. I would like to mention some of the most relevant books of John Ikenberry. You know many of them, and particularly what I consider a reference book for the international theory, Liberal Leviathan. As you know, Leviathan of Thomas Hobbes was published in 1651, and is the very background for the realist theory. We have by John Ikenberry the book on liberal Leviathan, and this, again, we come to this definition of liberal, and is particularly relevant to hear what is his understanding of this theoretical progress toward the traditional realism, which was the very background of Kenneth Waltz's first book. Reading Hobbes was the basis of Kenneth Waltz. I would like also to draw your attention on the work of John Ikenberry in history of political thought. He is author of a book on crisis of American foreign policy, Wilsonian in the 20th century, and he provided a lot of research about the Wilsonian time of the internationalist tradition in the United States. And also, I would like to draw your attention on his intervention on a regular basis during the post-Cold War period. For instance, his contribution of 2008, The End of the West, question mark, Crisis and Change in Atlantic Order, the relation between Europe and United States. John Ikenberry is a leading thinker at the level also of a larger public opinion. Let me underline that he provides on a regular basis editorial article in Foreign Affairs, and I'm very impressed by the clarity by which he was able to react to the challenging times we are living, and in particular, how important for him is that democratic intellectual who strongly believe in the construction of peace through stronger international institutions play a role in the current difficult time. Among his many public activities, I remember also that Professor Ikenberry served as member of the policy planning staff in 91-92, and as a member of an advisory group at the State Department in 2003-2004, as a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, task force on United States and European relations, the so-called Kissinger Summer Commission. He played also a very relevant role. So please, John, we are very happy to have you here. We are very curious about your answer to the question, what is happening to the liberal order? We have seen your presentation, and I think it's such a beautiful PowerPoint. Is promising good news.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to the Secretary of the Academy and to all of you for coming. Actually, I'm not sure it is good news. In some ways, I picked this picture because it's this Thomas Cole, one of the murals that he put together in the 19th century during what was in that period a debate in Britain on decline, rise and decline. And this is one of the murals of the course of civilization, the rise. Earlier murals depict the bucolic origins of civilization, then the great high point, the zenith, and then this is kind of when things fall apart. So it's actually posing a question through the picture, are we moving into an era where things are falling apart, where we are in an era not of building order, but of seeing order fall apart? And if that's true, what do we do? How do we think about it? What do our theories tell us we need to do? So it's great to be here to ruminate, to think about these issues with you. As Mario suggested, I am seen in the Academy as a theorist of liberal internationalism. So not liberalism, but liberal internationalism, which is often put alongside realism as one of the two great traditions of international thought. And to be a liberal internationalist today is to be really confronted with not very happy times. These are moments where liberal internationalists have a hard time figuring out what kind of world we live in. It's not a happy time for liberal internationalists or for the post-World War II Western-led international order that has provided the basis for regional and then global order over the last decades. Democracies, liberal democracies around the world, individually and collectively, are struggling. There are populist revolts against immigrants, against globalization, against trade, new forms of protectionism, questions about the commitment of major democratic states to the multilateral trading system. And I would say 2016 was a particular year that we will remember as a kind of breakpoint in international relations, when we had not one but two inflection points, it seems, in international relations, certainly in the liberal democratic West. Brexit in the UK and the election of Trump. And when you think about it, these were, of course, individual events, but together they seem to suggest something larger. And these two states, in the 19th century Britain, in the 20th century United States, were leading liberal states attempting to build open, rule-based international order, along with doing many other things. But the fact that these two states that have imprinted themselves on the international system seem to, in 2016, to have said, we've had enough, we want to pull back, we don't believe in our project anymore, is extraordinary, surprising, and it requires us to think anew about basic ideas about how the world operates and whether liberal democracies can find themselves, find a way for themselves to solve their problems and move forward. Existential questions are being asked about liberal democracy and the future of the West. This is a nice representation of this by a New York Times columnist who's a conservative, who's arguing that here in the dying days of 2015, so a year before 2016 and Brexit, something seems to have shifted. For the first time in a generation, the theme of this year was the liberal order's vulnerability, not its resilience. 2015 was a memento mori moment for our institutions, a year of cracks in the system, of crumbling firewalls, of reminders that all orders pass away. This is clearly something that we're all worried about. We see that we've seen a shift from the last 25 years. It's surprising. We didn't expect to see it coming. Think about it. Just 25 years ago, we were operating under the assumption that the opposite movements of history were unfolding, that liberal democracy was on the march. Countries in the 70s, but more so in the 80s and 90s, were making democratic transitions in Eastern Europe, in East Asia, in Latin America, all integrating themselves into the international system, into the world economy, and making liberal democratic moves. Later, the Green Revolution and the Arab Spring. Walls were coming down, not going up. So it seemed to be a moment of great hope and anticipation for a global order that might be built around liberal democratic ideas. And at the global level, you had a variety of movements forward that liberal internationalists like myself applauded. Global governance seemed to be thickening, seemed to be intensifying. The G7 became the G20. NATO and the European Union were seen as expandable institutions that could allow new states to integrate and to realize their ambitions. The Soviet Union was not, at this point, it was out of business. It was now Russia and making some integrative steps, and certainly China was. China was joining the WTO. Ideological rivals to liberal democracy did not seem to be found anywhere. And then you had the kind of the high academic theorists of this moment also weighing in. Francis Fukuyama arguing about the end of history, that in the realm of ideas, it was a very careful argument, in the realm of ideas, alternatives to liberal democracy have all failed. Communism, monarchicalism, theocratic regimes, autocracy. And then Professor Sen, the Indian-born Harvard economist, writing that there was a new belief that he had, that democracy was a universal value, achieved the status, he argued, of being taken generally as being seen as generally right. Democracy was, in some sense, the most valid and legitimate global norm. All of this, of course, has been unwinding now, and this is what's so surprising. This triumphalist moment has ended. The signs are everywhere, both outside and inside the West. Outside the West, China and Russia are pushing against the Western, American-led liberal order, cracking down inside of their societies on civil society, on NGOs, on free speech, on the press, on transnational groups that have connections to the outside world. And they are in their own ways, and China and Russia are not alike in many ways. They're doing things differently, but they are both more so than we would have anticipated, committed to a kind of sphere of influence kind of attempt to build up their regional position, to push out others, to build their own dominating hierarchies of control. And of course, President Xi, while he has been actively moving into the world of trade and finance and investment and spreading its role in the world economy, it's simultaneously been pushing in an illiberal direction and an autocratic direction at home. And I think probably the Chinese speaker, Jing Guangchen, who was here last week, he and I probably agree more on the world than we do with our own governments at this point. And he would probably agree that his own government is not necessarily walking in the direction that many of us thought. Reactionary politics are, of course, occurring elsewhere as well. In Europe, Hungary, and in Poland, in Turkey, in the Philippines, we have even political scientists are trying to figure out this new kind of illiberalism that is being conducted through kind of legal means, but it's an autocratic project of cutting back on the legitimacy and power of the press, using laws to reduce the ability of opposition groups to rule, and that having an accumulating effect. There's not a single moment when a democratic state crosses the Rubicon, as Julius Caesar did, where it was a one moment where it was democratic, then autocratic. It's more of an incremental slicing of the change, which is hard to appreciate and react to. And then, of course, we have Trump himself, who is, in most ways that we describe American leadership, he is moving in a direction that we have not seen before. He has been on all the great issues that the United States has been seen to be part of: trade, alliances, international law, constitutional rights, torture, immigration, on all that package of internationalist ideas that the U.S. has been a part of, in many ways leading for 70 years. He is now backtracking in dramatic ways. And the U.S. now can no longer be seen around the world as a patron or guarantor of this global liberal international order. And so we have the debates going on. What is going on? How deep is this crisis? So what is the diagnosis? Perhaps the most promising one, or the one that would be the least monumental, would be that we're kind of in a dip in the road towards a more liberal, democratic, multilateral world. That is, we're waiting for new leaders, perhaps a new growth model, and that we can kind of get back on track, that this is a kind of momentary bump in the road. Trump may only have 4 years. He may not last 4 years. There will be a successor who will take us back in a different direction. So this would be a kind of optimistic view, but it may be a deeper crisis. It may be a crisis of the U.S.-centered liberal order, the so-called hegemonic organization of this system. The U.S., even with a non-Trump, may not be able to return to a position of leadership. Or it could be deeper still, the whole logic of liberal internationalism, of open, rule-based order, may be giving way to a future that's built much more around blocks, zones, imperial projects, and spheres of influence. That would be a fairly significant shift in a disjunction in the global system. And if that weren't enough, philosophers today are even debating deeper shifts, what is often called the crisis of liberal modernity, that is to say, the Enlightenment foundations of modern polities that we trace back to the 18th century, and the idea that there is reason and there is knowledge, there is science, there is learning, and there is the capacity of humans to build and reform institutions, to bend history in a progressive direction. What if that's gone? What if we've lost that ability to acknowledge facts and learn If that is the case, then we are really in truly uncharted territory. This is how the Enlightenment ends. So those are the various levels of critique, and no one knows who's right, and there are clearly different positions and a vigorous debate. My own position, as a kind of optimist, not because I have a prediction of the future, but I'm an optimistic person because that's a way of living your life, not a way of making predictions. But I'm optimistic in that sense, that one can look out there and see resiliencies and see new ideas and new voices that can bring us out of this crisis into something that might be called a progressive direction. The problems of liberal democracy are deep, I think. They aren't simply Trump. Trump is consequence as much as cause of our crisis, so too Brexit. But it does help to take the longer view, and this is where I would suggest historians who can look at the global system across centuries and can see with a broader perspective that liberal democracy has always been in a struggled relationship with alternatives and with its own excesses. It has constantly been in a state of reform and reconsideration. Liberal democracies have, at the same time, I would argue, a special capacity to learn and adapt. The owl of Minerva for liberal democracies doesn't rise at dusk. It's more like noon. They make mistakes, but they muddle through. That's certainly something we can argue on the basis of history. And most importantly, perhaps, there aren't great alternatives. China and Russia and these various demagogues, Trump, they don't have a vision. They can pull things down, but they don't have a sustainable project for putting things up. And in that sense, we will, I think, at the end of the day, be looking for some kind of reform of our liberal democratic institutions and of our liberal international world order. To make that kind of argument, I want to make a series of observations and then say a little bit about how I see the crisis, and then make some final reflections at the end of my talk on what we should be thinking about, what we should be hoping for, how we can take steps to move towards a more inclusive, integrative system of global governance. So my first observation is that we do have decades, indeed almost a century of thinking and projects that can be called liberal internationalist. From the 19th century, the abolition of the Corn Laws, the emergence of international movements for law, the arbitration movement, the peace movement of the 19th century, the dozens and dozens of congresses of nations that were held in the 19th century, the 20th century efforts after World War I and after World War II to build global institutions that would service our goals in security and economics and politics. All of these efforts that have been tried repeatedly by liberal democratic states across the 19th century and 20th century all involve a set of ideas, a kind of cluster of ideas that we can call liberal internationalism. Liberal internationalism. It has a variety of key features. Openness is clearly something which you can put alongside alternatives, closed imperial blocks, open systems. We each have access to each other's society for trade, for exchange, for investment. Loosely rule-based relations. This is the commitment to multilateralism, to not simply a world based on power politics, but on some kind of agreed ex ante a commitment to principled mechanisms for doing business with each other based on broad, even universal notions of interaction and cooperation. Rule-based relations. Progressive goals. This is clearly something that liberal democracies have seen working together as not simply a static equilibrium where we trade and we're all better off, but it's kind of static, but that we're going somewhere with our project, that we're working together to lift up segments of society, to educate, to enlighten, to solve problems that come from our collective humanity. And fourthly, there is in the liberal internationalist tradition a kind of commitment to reform, that we can build institutions that can make us better off. Woodrow Wilson, who I do partly because I work in the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton in some of what I do. Woodrow Wilson's ghost is in my building, so I think a little bit about Woodrow Wilson. But he was one of the fathers of liberal internationalism, and he constantly in his letters to others would talk about the corrigibility of institutions. Well, what does that mean, the corrigibility? Well, we know what incorrigible means. That means you just can't be disciplined. An incorrigible kid who keeps doing bad things. You can't, no matter what you do, that child is incorrigible. Well, the opposite is corrigible. We're reformable. We're able to take problems and solve them. So the corrigibility of the global system is a core commitment of liberal internationalism, and it separates them from realists who think that power and cycles of rise and decline are the ultimate arbiters of history and of international relations. So this is the view, liberal internationalism. There's a set of ideas. Not that everybody agrees, because there are, on the side parts of liberal internationalism, are neoliberals, like the Thatcher, Reagan, neoliberals, are they part of liberal internationalism? Well, there's a debate. Are neoconservatives, who were the architects of the Iraq War, they believed in democracy promotion, but they didn't believe in multilateralism. So there's always a kind of gray area where thinkers are not necessarily fully understood to be inside of it. But there is overlap and there's debate. And there's a project. There's a sense that we're moving across time, that the 19th century thinkers who were building projects for international law, the jurists of that day, the arbitration movement, the later collective security project of Woodrow Wilson and others, that there's a kind of building on what was attempted before, a kind of lineage, genealogy, a sense that we are in a project that crosses generations, that we do things and we pass them on to the next generation. That notion of being in a long-term political project is something that is associated with liberal internationalism, as it is with other kinds of projects: political realism, communist internationalism, social Darwinism, post-colonialism. Those would be alternative big ideas, big schools of thought that are theoretical schools of thought, that have narratives of how the world works, that have histories of different leaders at different moments making breakthroughs, successes, failures. So there's a whole world of ideas and projects that we can call liberal internationalism, and it's unfolded over 2 centuries. Second observation, liberal internationalism is a project for creating international space so that liberal democracies can survive and thrive. This is what Wilson famously said in his 1918 speech before Congress, making the world safe for democracy. That can be read 2 ways. Making the world safe for democracy has often been interpreted as we need to spread democracy worldwide, and that's a very controversial argument. But Wilson, I argue, meant it in a different sense. Not we need to make the world fully democratic, but we need to make the world organized in a way that those countries that are liberal democracies can be stable and succeed in preserving their own values and way of life. So liberal democracies realists talk about states in the system are like billiard balls on a pool table. They crash into each other, they're hard to kind of control. But liberal internationalists see liberal democracies not like billiard balls, but like eggs that can easily crack. And so the international system is like an egg carton. We don't go to the store and buy an egg and just throw it into our basket. There's a carton that it's in. Why? Because it protects it from cracking. And so too, the vision is liberal internationalism is a way of building egg cartons for the world. And it's a view that is growing over this 200-year period as liberal democracies emerge in the world. So the story really takes place and begins and continues as liberal democracies become more prominent. You have famously Samuel Huntington's waves of democratic international breakthroughs, the shifts in the system from autocratic to democratic states. They occur at different moments. There's pullback, then there's advance. They typically came after the world wars, when you got the decline of empire and self-determination movements, and then the fall of communism becomes another big jump. And so you have a world that across 200 years, there's a chart of the democratic share of world GNP across 200 years, and you see that the share of world wealth, of GNP, if you will, goes up as the liberal democracies become more numerous and as they become more successful in development. So this is a backstory for liberal internationalism. The third observation is that the rise of liberal democracies set the stage for liberal internationalism, but liberal democracies has needed a congenial international environment in which to thrive. That is to say, as you can see from that Huntington step, there's a wave kind of dynamic. It's not that countries individually looking inside of their own countries make decisions for democracy. There's an international environmental condition that makes liberal democracy more or less likely. So having a congenial international setting for liberal democracy is important. And we don't have it today, but we've had it in the past. One of my colleagues at Princeton, Carlos Bosch, has argued that using statistical methods, precisely these correlations between the presence of we'll call it a liberal democratic hegemon that's committed to providing support for countries that may be making democratic transitions. Obviously, Europe providing this role after the Cold War, but in earlier periods as well, this has been the case. And you have regional institutions, the EU and NATO, as kind of bulwarks, not always successful, as we're finding out in Eastern Europe today, but as platforms that can help liberal democracies succeed. Again, the problem today in Europe, perhaps, is that those kind of platforms aren't doing what they used to do in facilitating and supporting liberal democracy. A fourth observation I can make: liberal internationalism has transformed across the century. And the big transition has occurred between Woodrow Wilson's era and this is an American perspective, Franklin Roosevelt's era. Wilson was a very complicated person. He was not necessarily somebody that we'd like to be around. He was a difficult person. He had racial views that were not ones that we could accept today. He was an idealist in many ways. He was a conservative as much as a liberal, in the sense that he was a Burkean, and Edwin Burke was his hero in many ways, and so he had this notion of institutions as being organically conceived and developed. But he brought that to the international system and had this view about a League of Nations, collective security, international law, and free trade together, creating a nucleus for a larger international system of peace and security, a kind of Kantian vision brought into the early 20th century. FDR, who's I find much more interesting, more complex thinker, wrestling with problems that Wilson never did. He and that generation, obviously living through an even more catastrophic moment of world history than Wilson did. The generation of the 1940s saw what? Total war, Stalinism / totalitarianism, fascism, the Holocaust, and the dropping of the atomic bomb. all in one generation. So they did have to think hard about how to build international order. And if you were a liberal internationalist then, you were in even greater sensing a sense of anxiety than you do today because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a odious figure, but he doesn't represent a threat to the world the way Hitler and Stalin did. And here you have liberal internationalists trying to figure out how do you move forward in the wake of that darkness. And they made moves that I think we still appreciate today. Number one, they expanded the notion of rights and protections, at least rhetorically. FDR's Four Freedoms, the Atlantic Charter, these were ideas that democracies who were faced with a war, Britain and the United States in particular with the Atlantic Charter, had to convince their liberal democracies that fighting a war was worth it. And they, in a sense, said, if we fight this war and if you stay with us and we win this war, we're going to build a better world on the other side. We're not just going to go back to the old ways. We're going to do new things. So liberal democracies tend to have these kind of inflated war aims, as they did in the time of Wilson. But with Roosevelt, they were really about a kind of social democratic New Deal for the world kind of vision. Four freedoms: freedoms from want and hunger, freedom for religion and speech, the four freedoms, the Atlantic Charter. A new emphasis on multilateral governance following the New Deal. You should read the letter of FDR that he sent to the Bretton Woods conference in 1944. He didn't go, but his letter reveals the kind of public philosophy of a liberal internationalist. The argument he made was, we now live in a more interdependent world, certainly in economics, where bad economic policy on the other side of the horizon can come this way and inflict harm on us. So we have to be, on an ongoing basis, working with those people over there, coming together in places like Brussels and Paris and Washington to Geneva to have constant multilateral management of an increasingly complex interdependent system. And he used the idea of contagion. We think of disease, a disease in some small developing country in Africa can quickly come across the Atlantic, the oceans, or the continents and spread around the world. So infectious disease is actual contagion. But the same idea is in the heads of these 1940s thinkers when they're talking about economic contagion and other kinds of problems of interdependence. So this is very important for the rethinking and deepening of liberal internationalism. There's a nascent universalism in the 1940s that the world is connected in new ways. That follows from what I just said. There's a lovely little moment when FDR was dictating his speech that would become the Four Freedoms speech. It was his inaugural address, it was his speech to Congress in January of 1941. And he had tried out this Four Freedoms language in a radio broadcast a few weeks earlier. But he basically knew what he wanted to say, and he was dictating his speech to his secretary verbatim. And he talked about these four freedoms are freedoms that should be enjoyed everywhere, that is to say, globally. And his closest confidant, a guy named Harry Hopkins, who was in the room, said, Mr. President, do you really mean everyone should have these freedoms? After all, do we really expect the people of Java to want these freedoms as well? Are the American people going to accept that kind of global ideal? And FDR reportedly said back to Harry Hopkins, yes, Harry, in a world that we're moving into, even the people of Java are soon going to be our neighbors. So again, this sense of shrinking space, contagion, interdependence, and how do we build order to cope with that problem? It sounds very familiar to the world that we're trying to figure out today. And then finally, there was a more expansive vision of security. The notion that it's not just physical security, that tanks coming over the border could attack us and harm us, but security in the stronger sense of well-being, of health and welfare. Coming out of the Great Depression, economic security. In the United States, we had the Social Security Act of 1935. We had the Full Employment Act of 1946. Economic security, social security, national security, building that more ongoing system of government capacity to protect security, provide security on an ongoing basis, economic, political, strategic, technological, linguistic, economic, and so forth. So there's this breadth of what the agenda is. The fifth observation is, it's not just ideas and rhetoric, there was accomplishment. There was a kind of a building of an international order, of international society that the U.S. and its democratic allies engaged in post-1945, open, loosely rule-based, and progressively oriented. I just one day sat down with a piece of paper and kind of wrote down things that governments did together to create a greater kind of infrastructure of global cooperation. And I found more stuff than I thought I would. Stuff that Donald Trump doesn't know anything about. If you run into him, could you tell him to look at this PowerPoint slide? Lots of things, economic and trade and economic openness, RTAA. That was the first pro-trade initiative coming out of the Great Depression. 1934, the Depression was not over, but they were starting to negotiate reducing tariffs. GATT, WTO, Bretton Woods, export-import, human rights, extraordinary efforts through protocols and charters, not all of them signed or implemented, but they're out there. International arms control. There was even an attempt to have international control of nuclear technology and weapons. Atoms for Peace, non-proliferation, the Soviet-US efforts should give us hope that countries, very different regime type, in a global bipolar struggle, they agreed to limit their arms. This can be done. Sweeping arms control reductions under Reagan and Gorbachev, and then global commons in the environment, Outer Space Treaty, Law of the Sea Treaty, international regimes for telecommunications and air travel, regimes to combat pollution of the ocean, stratospheric ozone depletion, that's the Montreal Protocol, the protection of endangered species and wildlife, the abatement of gases contributing to global warming, the WHO, which was and is an international organization that during the period of the Cold War, countries across the Iron Curtain worked together to eradicate smallpox. So there is a history of the 20th century where, led by liberal democracies, you get a building of an international system, a system that is now in danger. So what has happened? So this is kind of the last part of my talk, and I'll just simply say my own argument is the following one. The liberal international order, this is in some sense the bad news, was never a global order, really. It was a Western order that was built after World War II inside of a bipolar world system where the Soviets and the Americans were competing, and the West and the world of communism were competing. With the end of the Cold War, that inside order became the outside order. That's the big symbolic moment, was probably the demolition of the Berlin Wall. The inside order became the outside order, and this had two long-term impacts. One is it unsettled the global governance system. The old bargains between G7 countries, partners, institutions, were overrun by a kind of global expansion of capitalism and of the global system generally. So the old foundation for liberal order, which was a Western foundation for a Western system with a little bit more than the West, got overrun, and the foundations, the bargains, the politics, the frameworks were insufficient to support this global mobilization of political economy. Secondly, the social purposes have eroded. And this is where the term neoliberal comes in. In some ways, liberal internationalism became neoliberalism. It became a framework, or seen as this by many people in Europe and the United States, as a framework for transactions, particularly among international capitalists. Bankers and financiers, liberal internationalism is basically their playground for doing deals. And it's lost the sense that liberal order is a safe haven for liberal democracies. It's an egg carton for fragile eggs. That's been lost. We can look more closely at that. This is something I found a couple months ago. The press release when Dean Acheson, who was Secretary of State under President Truman, announced NATO. So what did he tell the American people about why we were doing NATO? Well, it's a very value-oriented story. It's the Atlantic world is not an ocean with two different people on either side. It's an inland sea around which a common people live. We're all living around the same lake, if you will, with the same common institutions and moral and ethical beliefs. It's a very, you would say, civilizational kind of idea, but kind of there's a moral order aspect to it. We're together because, in some sense, it's morally uplifting to be this way. We share things. This sort of language has disappeared. I asked an historian, is this just kind of BS? Is this just kind of you say whatever you need to say to sell your NATO product to the American people or to the Europeans? And this historian who studied this very closely said, no, Dean Acheson really believed that. I mean, this is not something this is not rhetoric or PR. So three sources of the erosion of social purpose. One is simply the globalization of the international order has reduced this idea of a security community, this lost sense that we're a single container with different eggs in it. The old G7 world was, as I've suggested, a kind of full-service political order. It is now seen less as a community where to be in it is to be safer and more secure and to have more opportunities. We've lost that normative sense, that legitimacy that comes with a sense that it's doing work that we want it to do. More diverse groups of states have come into the order. Democracies old and new, Western, non-Western, colonial, post-colonial, highly developed, less developed. Each, and particularly West, non-West, and developed post-colonial, think of India and Brazil, they come with different narratives of what liberal democracy is, grievances, baggage, expectations, agendas, ambitions are different. And now, so we have a larger and more diverse set of actors. And this has reduced the sense of community or a shared narrative of why we are together. And then third and finally, the economic part of the story, the embedded liberalism, that's the social democratic foundations of the post-war systems in Europe and the United States have given way to a much more unequal, stagnant kind of life for many workers and working class and middle class. Stagnant income, stalled economic advancement of working class and middle class, together with rising inequality. The winners, the losers are more dramatic in both directions. Branco's book, which is a great book, it really tells this story. And he has this so-called elephant curve. You can all see, this is the back of the elephant, and this is the trunk, and this is the bottom. This is us, by the way. So this is the story of the world as a single unit and different quadrants, quintiles, that are based on where you are economically in the global system. So in the middle, 40, 50, 60, that you're still very poor. You're probably from India or China, and you may have a $5 a day kind of income, but through the last several decades, because of the globalized world economy, you've entered the workforce and your wages may have doubled from 5 to 10. That moves you way up, even though the 10 dollars for a unit of work is still not nearly what you get in the developed world, you see your life opportunity in the relative terms going way up. Whereas the working and middle class in the Western industrial societies have seen stagnant income and wages. And then finally, the richest of the rich have just seen their bank accounts just explode, and they are the 0.01% that everybody talks about. So my last slide is really just to reflect on what does this all mean, and what kind of questions should we be asking about the future. One question I would ask is, can there be a reestablishment of the domestic and international connections to liberal democracy? In each of the eras across the last 200 years where liberal democracies have done great things in building a world order that we might approve of, that has been connected to domestic agendas, progressive agendas. In the late 19th century, it was reform capitalism, what the British called reform liberalism. The US, that period and later, was called progressivism. In the 30s and 40s, it was the New Deal period, social democracy. In the 60s and 70s, it was called Great Society. So you have like 4 or 5 great eras of times over the last 200 years where liberal democracies were strengthening their ability to achieve socioeconomic goals at home, and they were tied directly to building a better international system. That connection is gone today. And so the question is, can we reestablish it by conceiving of how our domestic systems can be reformed and advanced, and connect that to an international order that creates capacities for governments to help those governments at home do things that their citizens want. Secondly, can we bring new bargains and institutions to bear to bring those countries that are not rejecting the liberal international order, think of India, think of Brazil, but want to have more voice, more authority, a seat at the table, and to change the agenda slightly in their own way. And then thirdly, liberal internationalism and modern liberalism generally is being bashed by critics on the right and the left, by leftists like Mishra, who think that liberal democracy is just a kind of facade for imperialism and for capitalist class exploitation of the poor, and on the right, who see that liberal democracies are basically dysfunctional and cannot compete against the autocratic rivals of Russia and China and so forth. How do you legitimate that middle position? Always difficult, because liberalism, as modern liberalism, is a mishmash. It's trying to reconcile contradictions. It's trying to support values such as tolerance, but it's trying to promote democracy. It's trying to reconcile democracy and liberty and equality. So how do you have an equal society but have a society built on freedom? In deep ways, they're incompatible, and liberalism is kind of this muddled exercise in trying to balance contradictions. Now, the other problem that liberal internationalism has is that the major sources of support, as I've suggested in my lecture today, are for working together to build egg cartons, have been appeals to self-interest and to values. Interest would be, we trade together. If we trade, we'll both be better off. Winners win more than losers lose in a trade system. And we'll give some of the winnings to the losers, and we'll harness that wealth and create a more better society. That's the interest-based. The value-based appeal is, we're democracies, and we should work together because we do come from a common historical value trajectory. Those two are fine, but there's a third source of cooperation that has never been given as much recognition, and that is what I would call mutual vulnerability. We aren't together because of values. We aren't together because of trade. We're together because if we aren't together, we're each going to suffer accordingly. You can't be secure alone. You can only be secure together. I just made that up. So it's the argument that Benjamin Franklin, who was the old man at the American Constitutional Convention, after it was over, he said, this is, here's a constitution, see if you can keep it. He said something like, we will, it's actually when it made the big announcement to the British that we were going to seek independence, he basically said, now that we've made this break, the 13 colonies will have to hang together or surely we will hang separately. And that is very much the same argument here, that if we don't work together, we will hang separately, as in hang. That entails a slightly more world-weary, less ambitious, less progress-oriented vision of liberalism or liberal internationalism. It's more world-weary. Liberal internationalism is a way of solving problems as opposed to perfecting politics. It's a liberalism of fear, that if we don't build common institutions and seek political integration in the context of cascades of economic and security interdependence, we will certainly hang separately. And that, I think, in the end, is the best argument I can give you that there is life for liberal internationalism on the other side of this crisis. So there you have it.